My name is Diego Alcalá from the Anti-Imperialist Scholar Collective. We are here today with Navid Farnia, the author of one of our articles located on our blog. His article is on national liberation, combat intellectuals, and the imperialist university. You can find that article in our website, which is anti-imperialist.com. That's anti-imperialist with an S at the end.com. Navid, why don't you first introduce yourself and then we'll start talking about your article as soon as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Diego, for doing this and for interviewing me, having me on here. So my name is Navid Farnia. I'm a professor of Black Studies, and my work is broadly on the relationship between racial oppression in the United States and U.S. imperialism, U.S. Foreign policy, and broadly, really, U.S. imperialism. Particularly, my first book manuscript, which I'm working on right now, looks at national liberation movements during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, both within the United States and also outside. So I have various cases that I'm looking at, and each case is a chapter, right? So, for example, I have a chapter on the Cuban Revolution. I have a chapter on the Harlem Uprising in 1964 in New York, right? So all of these cases go into my analysis of what is called the U.S. national security state, but what I argue is a euphemism for counter-revolution, right? So the book is called National Liberation in an Imperialist World, Race, Counter-Revolution in the United States. And it is sort of a microcosm of my larger work and my larger project, which I get, again, is that relationship between racial oppression here in the U.S. and U.S. imperialism.
Amazing. Sounds amazing. I can't wait to see that out in print just because I know how difficult it is to actually sit down and write. So
Yeah.
we're all looking forward to that and obviously to reading it and congratulating you. So Navid, we're here today because we're talking about a specific article that you recently wrote for the blog regarding basically intellectual work as an academic, right? And the times that we're in, and the critique that you're making, which may not necessarily be something that is traditionally talked about when we think of universities. So, on that wonderful presentation, why don't you just give us the general theme of your article, your motivation, and then we'll get into it more specifically.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, the title of my article is On National Liberation, Combat Intellectuals in the Imperialist University. So basically the motivation behind this article, I started writing it actually last fall, um, and on the heels of uh, the student encampments and generally the student protests at these at universities across the United States and also beyond as well, right? But there was this sort of incipient student movement that was arising that was obviously challenging the Zionist genocide against the Palestinian people and the US's participation in that. But also, what I was arguing and and my argument is based on what I had witnessed was that students were going beyond that, right? Like they were challenging the general war profiteering structure of the Western University, right? And that Zionism functioned as the threshold for that, right? So they're challenging this entire history of the Western University and its ties with imperialism. And I thought that was extremely important, and it was part of my motivation for writing this article.
It's
Um,
amazing how students can trigger us, the positions that we hold and our own assumptions of what we're doing as scholars and activists within the university space. So it is a pretty amazing feeling to have that motivation come from the students in the real world. And as you mentioned, how multi-layered those protests have been throughout not only the United States, but across the world.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'll say as well, right? So the combat intellectuals aspect of it comes from sort of my theoretical analysis and specifically sort of inserting Frantz Fanon into the article. And we can talk about that later. But it's really about not just thinking in terms of intellectuals as like this sort of uh, imperialist aligned or liberal, like liberal orientation, but rather as intellectuals as aligned with national liberation, aligned with
Let's
the
let's
people's.
let's explore that quickly and define this as a little bit for people that may be encountering these terms for the first time. So, what you're doing is criticizing what we have right now. So, what is it, in your own words, that we have right now in many of the academic spaces that we're in?
Absolutely. So it's the imperialist university, and so what I'll say about that is. In the article, I outline basically 1,000 years of history, as far back as the Western University exists. The first one, being in England, Oxford, in the UK, and their ties with racial slavery, with colonialism, right, with genocidal wars, with all these sort of forms of brutal violence, global white supremacy, and patriarchy that have led to the degradation and oppression of, basically non-white peoples around the world, global South, third world peoples around the world, right? And so the university played a fundamental role in that. It's not as if like the university stands over here and the imperialist state stands over there. In fact, the university helps to facilitate the state's imperial project. Whether in westward expansion in the United States when the white settlers were colonizing indigenous lands, or all the way to today, right? Like with what's going on in Palestine and the university's complicity and their investments in the Zionist entity, but also, as students have pointed out, like I said, their complicity and their participation in imperialist wars in general, right? And ongoing processes of colonization. So yeah, so I
So
think
that's
that's
what we
where.
have, right? That's the basic structure of how higher education in the West has been developed and how it stands as it is. And your particular focus is what?
My particular focus is, I wanted to lay out this history and I wanted to point out, for my entire audience, for our entire audience, but particularly for the students, that their activities on these campuses is not isolated to this particular space, to this particular historical moment. But what they're in fact challenging is this larger historical structure that has led to the moment that we're in today, right? And so when students encounter all this repression, and the repression has been overwhelming for largely nonviolent protests, right? And students are wondering why there's so much repression for nonviolent protests. And this is what I'm trying to point out, because you're challenging the ideological structure of the imperialist university, right? And the material investments that it makes into imperialism. And so that's what, like, that's the intervention that I'm trying to make and what I'm trying to point out for the audience.
That's amazing. I think that's a very timely piece also, given how even though we've been in this particular moment of time with the ongoing genocide in Palestine, it has not, it does not appear that the students are backing down, right? It's an important continuation of that historical struggle against these particular institutions. So, how do you go about making that critique? I know you sprinkled Frantz Fanon in there, so let take a few minutes and then lay us out what your argument is or how you were able to tie all these points together.
Absolutely. So what I do with the article, I start by pointing out that what's happening on these campuses is a microcosm for what's going on in the world. And what's going on in the world is not, obviously what's happening in Palestine is central to everything. But what I argue is that we're witnessing the resurgence of national liberation. In other words, movements for the liberation of colonized peoples, peoples who are directly colonized, colonialism, or neo-colonialism, as in, for example, West Africa and the Alliance of Sahel states, and other forms of imperialism as well, right? So we're in this moment in the 2020s, and at this particular time, we're witnessing this resurgence of national liberation that, in fact, for me, has is at its strongest since not since like the 60s and 70s, right? That's the last time we witnessed this wave of national liberation. And so I start by highlighting that, and that's sort of the overarching, sort of context in which I establish. But from there, I get to from Frantz Fanon, which is you mentioned Fanon. This is where he comes in, right? Because he was writing at a time of national liberation, and specifically his context was French colonialism, and he was at the time in Algeria, right? So Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth, he has a chapter, which, by the way, I should say, for those who haven't read The Wretched of the Earth, it's a must read, probably one of the most important texts of the 21st century, particularly because of its anti-colonial, uncompromising anti-colonial sort of position. But he has a particular
Just a quick, it's just from the 20th century because it
20,
was
20, yes,
written.
yes, yes,
So,
that's
but
right.
besides the confusion and centuries, we're great. It is one of the
Yes.
most important pieces of intellectual liberatory pieces of out there, and everyone should read it. So, my apologies for the
No,
intervention. Go
no,
ahead.
I appreciate that correction because it's absolutely necessary. Yes, one of the most important books of the 20th century. And he has a chapter in the book, chapter 4. It's called On National Culture. It's not as quite as well read as the other chapters. The most well read chapter is On Violence, chapter 1, or Concerning Violence in other translations. But this chapter in particular focuses on the intellectual and on again national culture, right? And so what he lays out is the role of the colonized intellectual in the struggle for liberation. And he says that the colonized intellectual in the process of their own politicization undergoes three stages. The first stage is this assimilation into Western culture, right? Because the colonized intellectual is educated at Western universities, in whether in Europe or the United States, right? Um, so that's kind of, sorry, one second.
No, that's basically colonialism, obviously, right? Because there
Yeah.
are spaces. I'll give you the example of Puerto Rico. I mean, most of the professions, once the United States invaded Puerto Rico in 1898, were kept off limit unless those professionals went to the United States and learned all over in my profession as a lawyer. And up until today, in order to practice law in the federal court here in Puerto Rico, you need to take a federal bar, something that does not happen in many other bars across the United States. So, yes, the indoctrination into the metropolis education and system is mandatory in all of these colonized places.
So the second stage is the stage in which the colonized intellectual is witnessing the struggle for national liberation in their own country, whether it's Algeria or Kenya or wherever, right? And they become immersed in their own culture, right? But rather than becoming immersed in the actual struggle, they go back to some sort of idyllic past era, the pre-colonial era, and find themselves in culture in that era, right? Fanon problematizes this because he says that the struggle has moved beyond this, right? This is not like we're not at a time that we can come back to the pre-colonial era anymore. The struggle is moving beyond colonialism, right? And so that's where he then says the colonized intellectual eventually reaches the third stage, which is the stage of politicization and basically becoming a combat intellectual, produces literature and cultural productions that are in service of the act of struggle and in fact push it forward, right? He says combat literature, revolutionary literature, right? National literature. And so that's how national culture develops. For Fanon, national culture develops through the struggle for national liberation. And so that culture cannot be separated from liberation. All of that to say, in my article, what I'm pointing out is that the students are being politicized by the Palestinian struggle and by the struggle in West Asia and all these liberation struggles elsewhere in the world, right? And that's what's like pushing the situation forward. So right, so that's my theoretical intervention. From there, I talk about like the history of the Imperialist University, dating back, as I mentioned, all the way from the days of Oxford and Cambridge when they arose, and their investments in colonization, colonial expansion, and racial slavery, all the way to today, right? And I talk about even things like the emergence of area studies in the United States in the 1960s, where area studies were in fact Cold War productions, area studies being like, Middle Eastern studies or African studies or, Latin American studies. These are productions in these universities that are meant to better service U.S. imperialism in these regions of the world at the time of the Cold War, right? how does the United States quote unquote understand African peoples? Of course, we know that Africa is a huge continent, has many thousands of different peoples, but nonetheless, to lump it all into Africa and then have a knowledge production that sort of better facilitates imperialism, U.S. imperialism in Africa. That's where area studies emerges in the 1960s, in particular, 50s and 60s, right? So in that section, I outline the history of the imperialist university, and then I get it to the neoliberal era, this era of austerity and privatization, in which students are beginning to be charged gross exorbitant amounts of tuition, right? And that leads to a particular kind of gutting of intellectual production, and also the facilitation of this what we have is fascism all along, but this sort of acceleration of fascism and the continued accumulation of capital by the Western bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, right? And from there, then I get to the current moment. I obviously talk about Palestine, but then I also I make a couple of interventions in terms of not necessarily thinking about Palestine as a singular issue, but connecting it to other situations around the world. So, for example, Syria, right? A lot of people have talked about Syria as, a lot of liberals in particular, and even sometimes progressives in the left itself have talked about what happened in Syria last December as a quote unquote revolution. What I point out is that no, it's a counter-revolution that has serviced the interests of the Zionist entity and also and therefore U.S. imperialism, right?
Just to
And
put
so
our conversation in context today, we're the 15th of August and the Syria action occurred June 5th. No, not June.
December,
December, I'm sorry. So
yeah,
just wanted to put that in context. So what we know is that once that occurred, as you mentioned, many liberals and many intellectuals were very jubilant of this, according to them, liberation movement. And as you correctly point out, it actually is a counter-revolution movement.
yes,
It's in defiance of the liberation struggle that had been ongoing to a different degree, of course, in
yes.
Syria as opposed to other locations. So I just wanted to give our audience that context so we know the time frame that our conversation is emerging.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that. And I'll say that, and then what I also do with the article, and this is where like the news material comes in, because I told you I started writing this last fall. But the news material is on the heels of the Zionist aggression against Iran and the 12-day war and Iran's Operation True Promise 3. And basically saying that, you know, why this is important for students is because a lot of intellectuals in the West have maybe condemned the Zionist aggression, but have done so while at the same time saying that Iran is an an authoritarian government, and therefore we should quote unquote support the free peoples of Iran who are struggling for a new government on their own auspices, right? And I say no, like this is not the correct analysis, and in fact, this is frankly it's a counter-revolutionary analysis, right? Under different terms. Because and this is again where Fanon comes in. Fanon identifies the colonial world as a Manichaean world, structured between good and evil, right? So there's no in between good and evil. There's no in between colonizer and colonized, right? The Zionist regime is the colonizer, is the imperialist force acting as alongside the United States in the West, and Iran, alongside the axis of resistance in West Asia, is resisting that, right? So either you stand,
Just a quick plug there. We had on Patrick Higgins and his episode, and he gave us a brief understanding of what the Axis entails and the history of it. So for those of you that want to learn more about that, can also check that out.
excellent.
Sorry about
Yeah,
that.
so no worries at all. No worries at all. I mean, so for those intellectuals who are putting out statements saying that, we don't support the Zionist aggression against Iran, we condemn it, we want it to stop, but at the same time, we want it to stop so that an organic movement within Iran can arise to overthrow the government. That is a shameful and counter-revolutionary position, right? like especially when Iranian people themselves are rallying together to resist this aggression from the outside, right? And that's exactly what has happened since June of this year, June 2025,
And
right?
there's
During
a
the 12th.
history of that, right? There's a history. We see Cuba and the
Yes.
efforts, especially now that it's coming back, right? The hardening of the counter-revolution efforts in order to rally the local
Yes.
population in order to overthrow the Cuban government. I mean, it's
Yes.
not new, right? It's not something that we've seen, and yet we see the same type of language, as you mentioned, coming from places that are meant to critically provide
Yeah.
us with knowledge, which is
Yeah.
sometimes avoided in order to go, I guess, someplace else.
Yeah, and let me add as well, right, that people here in the West, including the left, celebrated the woman life freedom movement in Iran, right? Something that there's actually evidence that the CIA is behind that movement. But nonetheless, the people here in the West celebrated that. I mean, what does it mean that the State Department is repeating the same line about woman life freedom? What does it mean that this genocidal leader, Netanyahu, is saying woman life freedom at the very moment that the Zionists are attacking Iran, right? And so, like, is this something that you want to align with? And this is again where Fanon comes in with this analysis of a Manichaean world, the colonized world as a world divided in two, right? And so, a lot of these liberals, a lot of these progressives participate in this process of obfuscation, whether intentionally or not, it doesn't matter, but they do so. And in fact, in doing so, they service imperialism, right? They do the work of imperialism for it,
I think
right?
that's
And
a
that's what,
really powerful statement there, saying the obfuscation piece, the
yeah,
how we can celebrate feminism, but not your feminism, right? And how
yeah,
do we
yeah,
can celebrate and protect children, but we are silent when children are being blown from 2,000 feet or from a drone that's chasing the
yeah,
father that just finishes shift working at a hospital and waits until he gets home in order to blow the entire human existence out. So
yeah.
it is powerful. Go ahead.
No, I appreciate it. Yeah, and let me add too. So the reason why this particular section is important for the article is because students, a lot of these students who have been in these encampments, who have been at the forefront of these protests, oftentimes they're being taught by the very same professors who are signing statements like this about Iran or Syria, right? And so for me, it's important to say that, Iran is on the side of on the side of Palestine, right? And we need to be clear about that. And so when you're coming, like so you as a student movement, the student movement has been by and large solid. I don't want to make any critiques of the student movement, but to say that the work of the student movement is in this larger context, and this is what's going on in the world, right? Even like the NATO, like the NATO aggression and against Russia, right? I don't talk about that in the article, but that is another sort of point of, you know, point of perhaps departure and division that is also relevant here, right? So I think it's very important to point out that, with respect to Iran, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and let's not fall into those traps.
No, absolutely. And similarly, I think that the more information and um, academics like yourself producing this type of article critiques will allow many people who may be on the fence or may be willing to actually learn and reevaluate their positions and hopefully join the liberation army of knowledge production. It's not necessarily a situation in which everyone will read your article and nominate you to the Nobel Peace Prize, but absolutely, there are many people out there who will read these pieces, especially yours, and come away with a new paradigm. Just try to think through critically as to why is Fanon so important, and now you see that connection and how it materially reproduces itself within the student encampment movement, within the X, Y, and Z. And it's a very well done link that you've accomplished, and I congratulate you for that.
I appreciate that. And can I also just say really quickly,
Take your
the
time.
reason, yeah, the reason why this is all important is because, again, I mentioned this earlier, but it deserves emphasis, right? All this repression that students are facing, like it needs to be understood by both students and anyone else who's sort of interested in this and engaged in this, that the repression is, yes, about Zionism and about the sort of fascistic and genocidal nature of Zionism. But Zionism is the threshold point for all the other imperial violence that has occurred throughout the history of the West, right? And that is precisely what the student movement is challenging, right? The war profiteering sort of structure of the university, the capitalist the exploitative, oppressive structure of the university that dates back 1,000 years. They're challenging 1,000-year history of Western hegemony, liberal hegemony, and this is what the lines are, right? And so students and anybody else who is in this needs to understand what the lines are, and this is why the repression is happening, and perhaps anticipate these kinds of repression in the future. Not to discourage the students, but to anticipate and therefore tactically evolve themselves as well.
No, amazing because we may see these pushbacks from the administration, both governmental and institutional, as heavy-handed, but it is because exactly of what you're saying. It's because they are fighting the core of the system, right? You're
Yeah.
attacking the belief structure surrounding a system that has existed, at least in the academic space, as you mentioned, since the founding of institutions such as Oxford and Cambridge up 1,000 years ago that you mentioned.
Yes.
So, I mean,
And
these are significant movements.
yes, and this is the mark. This kind of violence is the mark of a declining empire, right? A declining U.S. imperialism. This kind of violence is to be expected, right? Unfortunately. But when empires tend to collapse, they become perhaps the most violent that they ever have been, right? And so students are not alone in coming up against this, but they're part of the sort of the target of that violence.
Yeah, I can't even think so hard as to what could happen, what more could happen, but we should
Yeah.
be prepared for that. Navid, I will give you the next section for you to say anything else that you want to talk about this piece. This has been a very illuminating conversation. I'm really grateful for having you here. I just wanted to reemphasize that the name of the article is I'm sorry, the name of the article is, I apologize,
No, no
On
worries.
National Liberation, Comeback Intellectuals and the Imperialist University, available at the website for anti-imperialist scholars, which is anti-imperialist with an S.com. Check out the blog there along with other excellent pieces. Before we head out, again, as I said, please take your time. Tell us anything else you would like. Where can we find additional of your work or whatever you just want to say? It's your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Let me just go ahead and first say that this article, again, speaks to the context that we're living in, right? The moment like is rapidly evolving. Even since I've written this article and this article come out, there's, just rapidly changing situation in the world, in cities in the United States like LA and DC, right? And we're just, as you and I speak, Diego, it's August 15th, as you said. The school year is about to begin. I'm interested to see what kinds of new strategies and tactics that students use to challenge these imperialist universities. And I would say that, this analysis and this conversation needs to be ongoing in terms of evolving tactics and strategies and evolving intellectual production, knowledge production that challenges the imperialist and liberal university, right? So I'll say that. In terms of my other work, like I have a piece on Chris Hani that is out. I wrote that I think last year, but it's a shorter piece on Chris Hani, who's a revolutionary leader in South Africa and the South African liberation struggle. And so I talk about Palestine a little bit in that article as well, because Palestine was already unfolding. It was after Al-Aqsa flood, October 7th, 2023. I've written about both the U.S. and China's sort of competing tactics in Africa, competing policies in Africa, whereas China sort of engages in mutual partnerships with African governments and co-development mutually constitutive development, the United States engages in processes of underdevelopment in Africa and exploitation and obviously oppression, right? And embracing authoritarian governments. So these are some of the things I've written about. I've written about the Los Angeles uprising in 1992. These are all available online. But yeah, I appreciate this conversation. I appreciate you asking about my other work as well.
Oh, absolutely. We are not that many, so we need to spread the joy. I
Yeah.
again thank you, Navid, for all your help, for your knowledge, for your sharing of your time. This is all the time we have for today, but please again go visit our website, check out these articles, share them, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much. Have a good one.